Pressing buttons.
Pressing
We
buttons.
found it.
We
We
found the
found the
button.
button.
Welcome.
All right.
Cool.
Found the button that does the thing.
The button that does the thing. In this case, the thing was to put our faces on a screen.
We are on the internet.
Who do we have this week, guys?
We have the prolific Steve Smith, or as he's known on the interwebs, R. Dallas.
I don't know if you've heard of him before. You probably have. We're hoping you have.
So it's funny. We were all talking before the show, and Steve was like, Dave was like, "Do you know Scott?" And Dave's like, yeah. Steve's like, "Yeah, I know Scott." And Dave says, "Do you know Cam?" And Steve says, I don't think I know Cam." And I said, "Well, I saw a talk you did in 2007."
I remember that talk.
Yeah, it was a good talk, and like we mentioned, I stole the demo. I used that demo when I was a premier field engineer here at Microsoft. Actually, I used that demo all the time to extol the virtues of output caching.
Nice.
Amazing.
Yeah, that was a 5-minute lightning talk. The demo was the whole thing.
But it was memorable because, Cam was able to think back to the year 2007 and recall what the talk was about.
Even though he doesn't remember yesterday half the time. I don't know how that works.
Yeah.
We won't go into why that might be.
So I
Cool.
think,
So-
for today's show, what we wanted to do was have Steve Smith, who is the author of one of our ebooks in the .NET Architecture Center, in our docs, actually talk about this book, but then also the accompanying sample app, which we refer to as eShopOnWeb. If folks have any questions, pop those in the chat. We've got the author sitting here with us right now.
Yeah, I wonder if I can jump in the chat too. I should do that. Connecting. There we go.
Mm.
I'm not All right.
So yeah, where do we start? I'll start picking questions here real quick because I'm kind of new to the .NET Docs team. So this whole eShop on web, like the fact that we can have external contributors put together something so prolific and so substantial, like how does that even work? Like what was your experience in working with the team and kind of bringing this content to our platform, and what did that look like?
So I've been both just a pure open source contributor on the docs, as well as a vendor contractor for Microsoft. So a lot of the larger content that I added to the actual docs when .NET Core was still pre-release was all done as a contractor. And the same is true for the eShop on web. So the experience there has been as a Microsoft vendor, which has been great. I've been doing that for years. But we also do curate community contributions as well, both in terms of issues where people report problems, and then full pull requests and things as well. So if we look at this project, you can go out to github.com .NET-architecture. There's a bunch of different stuff out there, not just this project. There's several different variants of the eShop on web sample that we're going to show here in a few minutes that you'll find there. And then eShop on web is the one that I maintain. One of the ones that I maintain actually. And it's basically a monolithic version of this online shopping application. And so before I go much further into that, let's just show a demo of what this thing looks like so folks have an idea. So when you run this app, this is it in Visual Studio, it blows up and says that you have to assign web as the startup project, because I literally just cloned this to prove that it kind of works when you first clone it. If there's a way to tell Visual Studio that this should always be the startup project, I would love to know what it is so I can add it. But every time I clone this thing for the first time, it always wants to make something else the startup project. So let's hit this and run it. That'll be a good community contribution, by the way. And here's what this thing looks like.
We're looking at you, chat room. No pressure.
I've got 3 Microsoft people on the line here, so they should be able to just, figure that one out for me.
Well, so that's a good question. I wonder where that default project metadata is persisted. Is that in that hidden .vs folder?
Maybe. Yeah, it must be somewhere, but it's not in GitHub. So every time I re-clone it for the first time, it's never there. So this is the store. Once you run it, it's a generic electronic shop right on the web. It has a bunch of products that you can add to a basket. It has some filtering here, so you can filter and say, I just want to see .NET stuff. You could say, I just want to see coffee mugs. Here's our wide selection of .NET coffee mugs. If you clear these back out, you'll be able to see it supports paging, so it knows how many products there are. It's showing you 10 at a time. You can page back and forth. It's got authentication using the built-in auth. In here, there's a demo user that you can use here, or there's also an admin user, which we'll look at in a minute. You can log in, and now you have access to your order history and your account information. We can add things to the cart and adjust their number of items and check out, and then go. You don't have to actually pay for anything, but they're not actually going to ship you anything either. You can view your orders. You can view the details. So here's this order that I just placed. And that's pretty much the whole application, right? But it's got enough content to it that it kind of showcases how to build an application using .NET Core. And like I said, this is all in a single application. So there's a core where all the business logic lives. There's an infrastructure where all the implementation details of all the dependencies lives. And then there's the web project. So it's just a single web project. There's no microservices. It's not deployed over Kubernetes or anything like that. Although if you're looking for that kind of thing, there is another parallel project, which is this eShop on containers, that does do that. And so if you look at this one, when you look at how many projects are involved here, there's quite a few more different things going on in this one because it does use a microservices architecture. Most applications, honestly, aren't going to need that. And I would encourage you to start with eShopOnWeb and get your system working well as a single deployable unit before you start trying to break it up into microservices.
Two
I would,
questions real quick.
I would chime in real quick before David's questions and just point out that Cam and myself are actually working on a Microsoft Learn module based on the eShop on web containers. So look for that in the very near future if that's something that interests you. But sorry, David, on to your questions now.
Oh, no worries, no worries. So there's two things that I noticed real quick. The first was that you mentioned that this isn't deployable on containers right now in the current state that's not using like the microservices approach, but there you have Docker Compose YAML and Docker Ignore and even a Docker file I saw inside the source.
Yeah, there's nothing
the
preventing you. Nothing prevents you from hosting this in a container, but it's not going to be deployed in multiple containers, right? So like a typical microservices application where you would have, the web.
Right.
The base web project might be in one container, but then you might have 4 different microservices behind it, deployed to other containers in a Kubernetes cluster,
Sure.
something like that.
Okay.
That's what the other project does.
Got it. And then also the other question was already answered in chat, which was, what is this cool little tool you're using here on the left? And Scott said it's Octotree.
That's Octotree. I expected that question as well. Having a Solution Explorer tree view in GitHub is amazing. So every time I stream or present and show this tool, people want to know what it is, and it's great.
All right, so I'm gonna have to jump on the bandwagon here. Is that a I guess that's a browser extension?
It is a browser extension.
Okay.
Yeah. You add it. It works with any open source project out of the box. If you go to a private repo, you just have to give it one of your authentication tokens, and then it can work with private repos as well. But it's awesome.
I put in the chat, I personally find that extension super useful for browsing files in a large PR. You get a better feel for what's in there. Because when you look at a PR, it's tough to get a sense of what's the directory structure that you're looking at.
Yeah, it works well with PRs too, and it just shows you what is changed there. So it's nice for that as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
You bet. All right, so let's jump into the code for a second. Well, actually, let's talk about the ebook because that was part of what we were looking at. So the ebook is actually hosted on Docs, right? So this is the Docs team on docs.microsoft.com. If we follow this link, you'll see that you can read the whole book just as a series of articles in the docs in here. And these are all open source. They're in the docs repo. And if you find a bug, you can come in here and edit the page and add a pull request for any of this. But they're also available as a PDF. So back to eShopOnWeb, this PDF right here, you can just click on that and it just takes you to a thank you page, and boom, you've got a PDF. And it's about 110 pages, so it's not terribly long, but it goes through the basics of how to build one of these applications. So the table of contents is modern web apps, spas versus other types of apps, a bunch of architectural principles, talk about client side, talk about how to do data access, talk about testing, and a little bit about Azure and how to host this thing on Azure if you want.
That's awesome.
All right.
So I noticed this is based on .NET Core 3.1. My assumption is once 5.0 hits GA, we'll see an update to this ebook shortly thereafter.
I would expect, yeah, that's what we've been doing. This has been around since 1.0, I think, or 1.1 at least, and we've been updating it as each new version ships. Usually the update lags behind the release by a month or two, but not too far. So I think we updated to 3.1 in like maybe, I don't know, January or February this year. So 5 months ago, we did some minor 3.x updates. So that was January-ish.
Can I put you on the spot? Sorry.
Go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, like, in your honest opinion, how painful has it been to keep with the updates? Has it been like a huge migration headache, or has it been somewhat smooth? And I guess what's your honest and
it hasn't really been too bad, honestly. One part that was bad, not terrible, but was more work early on, was when we shifted to use Razor Pages in the 2.x timeframe, and at that time we had two different web projects, and then we had to maintain them side by side. So we had a web, and then we had a Razor Pages web project.
Got it.
Separately, and that was painful just because there were two projects, and every time we made an update, we had to update in two places. What we have now is we've incorporated controller-based APIs, MVC view-based UI, and Razor Pages UI all together inside the app, side by side. So because you can support all those things in the same app, we have them all there. Not because we necessarily want to have three different ways of doing things, but because we want to demonstrate and showcase the different ways that you can display things and render data using ASP.NET Core. So in Pages, you'll see the home page for the site is this Pages index CSHTML. The admin section is also in Razor Pages, and the basket as well. But if you look under controllers, you'll see there's also a manage controller and an order controller that handle a few of the other endpoints, and then the API also exists, and there's not a whole lot to the API as it stands now, but it has a little bit of API stuff in there too.
So Steve, you mentioned something there that I want to dig into a bit. I want to get community members' perspective on this, rather than asking internally. When you made the shift from ASP.NET Core MVC to Razor Pages, what were some of the benefits that you realized in making that shift? And I ask this because when folks first see Razor Pages, one of the common things I hear is, oh my gee, it is web forms all over again. They see the page model, they immediately associate that with the code behind. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I don't agree with that, although it is the knee-jerk reaction. Razor Pages is MVC, but it's MVC with all the things you would want as far as feature folders in place. Right. So if you're not familiar with feature folders, one of the problems that you run into in a large MVC-based application, if you follow the default organization that we see here, where you have, forget about pages for a minute, but we have controllers and view models and views. Right. This is very common. All right, now you want to add a new page to this application. Well, what do you need to do? Well, you need to go into the controller, and you probably need to add a new controller, and then you need to go into the view models, and you need to add the view model that you're going to need, and then you need to go into views, and you need to add a new folder for the thing you want and scroll into that. Now, this is a very tiny application, so I can actually see all this on one screen, but in a real application for an enterprise company that has a large amount of views and controllers, you're going to be scrolling back and forth, up and down all day long, trying to find your controller with your view, with your view model, and it just gets to be a lot of friction, right? And so a lot of folks have implemented feature folders, or you can do some poor man's feature folders by using areas, right? Now, areas is better, but it still has some issues. So when you do it with areas, you end up polluting your routes because you have to have the area in the route, and you also still end up with a bunch of folders in here, typically for controllers and views and view models. If you use feature folders, and I'm apologizing, it's a long-winded explanation, but I have a whole conference talk I give on this. If you use feature folders, you basically modify the routes, and you make it so in the root level here, let's jump into Visual Studio for a second. In the root of the web, I could have a feature for something like, let's say, catalog. And so I could come in here and I could say add a new folder and call it catalog. And then in catalog, I would add directly in there catalog controller and my index.cshtml and my view model, and everything related to catalog would be just in that folder. All right, that's what feature folders are for MVC-based applications. They help because they make it so you're not having to go spelunking through this folder structure that gets longer and longer and longer. And of course, views and controllers are nowhere near each other alphabetically, so you end up having to scroll a lot. Okay, so why are Razor Pages cool? Well, Razor Pages take all that junk and they make it so easy to find because it's all basically feature folderized out of the box. So when I come in here and we look at, say, the index.cshtml on admin, well, the controller is right here, right? We don't call it a controller anymore. It's a page model. The action for get is right here. It's actually an event handler. It's called onGet, but it does exactly the same thing as the action method would do, and works just the same way. It still supports model binding, still supports filtering. Everything here still supports dependency injection. It's not like tightly coupled to HTTP context. There's no view state. There's no page lifecycle. It's not at all like web forms. The only thing that reminds you of web forms is that there's a page involved and the fact that there's a code behind with your view. Right, but there already was a code behind, if we're being honest. The controller was the code behind for your view before. It's where you ran the code that would populate the stuff that will show up on the view. We just didn't call it a code behind because it was in a different folder and it was much harder to find anything.
Out of the if you go back to the CS real quick,
Yeah.
is there a property called isPostback?
There's not.
Please,
Oh
God, no.
God, no, no.
Yeah.
No view
Yeah.
state either.
Right, yeah, there's no view state, no postbacks, none of that stuff. So Razor Pages, my opinion is Razor Pages are definitely a step up from MVC if you are doing view-based development using ASP.NET Core. Honestly, in the folks that I'm working with, most of them are using some kind of single-page application framework in front of ASP.NET Core. So generally they're hosting things in a static index HTML with Angular, React, something like that, and less and less, fewer and fewer people are doing page-based applications where everything is rendered on the server. But now we have Blazor, and so now we can still do all that cool stuff, but do it with Blazor either server side or in the client. And so that's actually the next thing I'm doing on eShopOnWeb is this admin page, which we haven't actually looked at yet, but it basically lets you update the products. This admin page I'm going to convert over to a Razor Pages application. Sorry, it's already a Razor Pages app, a Blazor application. So you'll be able to see what that looks like. So hosted inside of the admin folder, there will be a Blazor single page app using WebAssembly, and they'll have to add a few more API endpoints here so they can talk to the API, but you'll be able to see how you could host Blazor within an existing ASP.NET Core app, assuming I can get all that working.
Okay,
That's
I was just
crazy.
going to ask the question, which flavor of Blazor, but you answered. So it's not Blazor Server, it's Blazor WebAssembly.
That's my intent, because that's what just came out. And I think that's what more people are going to want to see. I could try and do both and maybe put them in different spots in the site or have some way to toggle it. But my intention at the moment is for it to be WebAssembly.
That's awesome. That's going to be so cool. I'm looking forward to it. So if you were to successfully pull it off, assuming that you will, you'd actually have essentially 4 different versions of a way to run like the Razor engine over generating pages, right? So
Well, the API doesn't do Razor, so I think it'd be 3, right? So we'd have views, we'd have Razor Pages, and we'd have Blazor WebAssembly. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, that's a lot. At that point, you might as well just add like Vue.js and React and Angular and have them all showcased in there.
So
there is some of that. If you want to see eShop with different front ends, there's some different branches and folders that have done that. So if you look around in the GitHub repos, you'll find some of that.
That's awesome.
So
But-
Steve talked about this feature folder approach, which I'm personally a huge fan of. The next question I had for Steve was, if you look at what you're getting out of the box with ASP.NET Core versus third-party dependencies that are used in this project, I guess that's where this conversation naturally goes. I see you're using things like Jimmy Bogart's Mediator project. Could you talk briefly about what those third-party dependencies are that you're using in this app, and then what purpose they serve?
Sure. So here's my list of dependencies, which is probably a little bit small. So let me just go and show it to you here and make that bigger. All right. And so if we look at these, we've got Mediator. We've got some extensions to do DI with it. These are all Microsoft things. We've got Swashbuckle, which is pretty standard as well. And the other ones I think are all being pulled in from the other subfolders. So let's go over here. This one's got some EF Core extensions that that I wrote that are actually in our Dallas package, and they just help me with loading up the configuration files. And then in Application Core, there's another one of my packages, which is this guard clauses. So let's start with Mediator, and we'll just do a Control T and look for Mediator here. And in this case, we have Mediator being injected into the order controller. And we're using a different approach to how we're going to route tasks to the controller endpoints so that we have thinner controllers, so the controller doesn't end up having too much stuff in it. So order controller, let's see, where's this called? This is the API. All right, so this is getting called with either a get or a post to view your orders. Actually, no, two gets. All right, so either view your orders or view order details for one order. And what we're doing with Mediator in this case is instead of actually getting all the details about the order directly inside of this My Orders endpoint, we're keeping this really small by delegating that to some other thing, right? And this code doesn't actually even know what's going to handle that, right? There's no direct link here. I'm not using a service that I had to inject. I'm only depending on Mediator in this controller. Right? You can see that's the only thing I'm injecting. So the way that works is inside of startup.cs. Let me get this out of the way. Down here, we'll go to startup, and let's see, I think it's in startup. Let's see if we can find where Mediator is. There it is. But where else is it? There we go. So we add Mediator, and Mediator scans this assembly. So we say whatever assembly this type is in, we're going to scan that for any types that Mediator needs to know about. Now, what Mediator's job is to let you fire off messages and then have them get handled by some handler. And so it has a few different interfaces that it supports for that purpose. And so if we come in and look for where that handler is going to be, and I don't know where it is off the top of my head, so I have to find it. The handler is going to take care of doing that work inside the thing we were just in. What were we in? Order controller? Yeah. So we're going to send the result of this get my orders helper method. So let's go to that definition. And this is going to be an iRequest type of IEnumerable of order view model. So if we search for all the references to this iRequest type, there is this get my orders, get order details, these two requests. Now there's going to be a handler for these two requests that's going to take, essentially this is a DTO. Generally they're populated all their data in their constructor. They could be immutable. We could make these private sets. When we get C#9, we might make them actually record types.
It's funny you mentioned that.
Exactly.
I actually raised that question to David in the last show that we did. What I was specifically hoping to do is take a DTO like the one you're showing here and use C#9 records instead. Right,
and that would be a perfect place to do so. Now, these are organized as features. So there's actually a features folder that has these two features in it, which I'd forgotten, honestly, but now that I see it, it makes perfect sense. And so finding the handler that goes with these is actually pretty easy once you see that they're in this folder. And so here's the handler. And the handler does the work of actually going and getting the data that's needed. These are async. They don't have to be async, but in this case it is. Or actually, no, I think they are all async now. Mediator's shifted over. So back in the day, Mediator used to have both sync and async. Now it's always async. And so we take in our request, that get order details request that has the information that we need to look it up. And we do our call to a repository. We get back the data. We return null if we don't find anything. Otherwise, we transform that into an order view model. We could be using another of Jimmy Bogard's projects here called AutoMapper. In this case, we're not, although we've discussed it, and I think there's some issues in the history about adding it. there's not any reason why we wouldn't do that. It's just one more third-party dependency that we haven't actually added to the project yet. And in this case, our mapping needs are pretty tame, right? So we just create the order view model with its items, and we return that back. So looking at the order controller, you see all this code here. All this code would have been directly in the controller. And so this controller would have, if we weren't using Mediator, it would have needed to depend on that repository to get that data. And then it would have had, 20 lines of code in here to actually fetch the orders. And it would have had all that dependency in the controller, and the controller would have been much larger. Since it's not there, the controller is very small. The handler is separate. And in fact, this handler, aside from the fact that it depends on a view model, if we changed that view model and made it a DTO that was defined in another project, like in the core project, we could actually take this entire handler and move it out of the web project and put it into our core project in our solution. And we can tell that because it doesn't really depend on a whole lot here except for view models that is in the web project. Now, why is that important? Well, everything that's in your core project, if you're following a clean architecture style, which this project does, is very, very testable, right? Because it has no dependencies on any infrastructure. So nothing in core depends on a database or an email server or the file system or anything like that, which means writing very fast automated unit tests is very easy to do. And so this handler is super easy to unit test. If I want to verify that when I call repository list async, if that thing brings back 0 records, that should return a null, I could easily write a unit test for that. And then I could also unit test that, hey, when I get back some data, does it get mapped properly to this DTO that I need? Then I can write unit tests for that. If I put all this inside of a controller endpoint, now it's going to be much harder to unit test because I'll be depending on HTTP context. I probably want to spin the thing up in a test server and actually hit that endpoint. And those types of tests are actually really easy to write in ASP.NET Core now. But certainly in previous versions of ASP.NET, like MVC, 1 through 5 before Core, that was a much more difficult thing to do. And in any case, it's just, sorry, let me finish. It's just a good idea to keep your controller actions as small as you can for a variety of reasons.
I agree 100%. I was going to ask Steve, what are you using for your testing needs? I assume X units. Are you doing any kind of mocking with MOQ?
Yeah, I believe so. Where appropriate. So
Okay.
here's the test. There's 3 different types of tests. So there's unit tests which don't have any dependencies, and there actually are tests here for these 2 sets of handlers that you could see. So when I say get order details, there's a set of tests that says get order details should not be null if the order exists, and it should be null if the order is not found. And so these are pretty simple. And so we just create the request. This is using XUnit, like you mentioned. We get a result back and we verify whether it's null or not in this case. Now this is using MOQ. So here's our using statement for MOQ. And we've defined a mock repository so that we can specify whether that repository is going to give us some set of data, regardless of whether there's an actual database involved. In this case, there's not. All the data is defined right here inside my test. So I create the items that I'm going to use for my test data. I create this mock repository, and then I set up that repository and I say, okay, whenever somebody calls list async and they pass me any of this specification type, and we'll talk about specifications in a minute, I want you to return a new list of orders, and I want it to include this order type right here, which we define here. Okay, and so that lets me then, in my tests, determine whether or not I want to do this or that based on whatever the value is.
Interesting. One thing I noticed is, a lot of people will follow a similar architecture. They'll use like a service and repository pattern. And a lot of times I'll notice that within their services or within their repository, they'll use, try catch, and they'll have error handling and logging and stuff like that. So with this mediator approach, where is it that you're doing that, or are you not, or what's your stance on that in terms of like an architecture decision?
So we're showing mediator as just another option, just to say up front. So there are, in fact, we had already talked about the different ways that you could do things. So the order controller uses mediator, the managed controller does not. And so if you want to see what it looks like without mediator, you would just do a look at this other controller and you can see here's what it looks like with all the logic in there. To answer your question, though, if you are using Mediator and you want to do, say, cross-cutting concerns like error handling, logging, things like that, Mediator supports a request pipeline, essentially. And so you can have a series of decorators over your handlers that will add on additional work around the handler that you're calling, very much like filters or middleware in ASP.NET Core. And so inside of, when I say mediator.send, and it goes to a handler. In this case, we were just looking at that handler. What's this? My orders. So here's this handler. Before it gets to this iRequest handler, I could have a decorator around that that's called a logging handler, right? And it could log all the details about this request and say, hey, I've got a request with these details, and it started at this point in time. And then it would let me call into my handle method here, right? It would run this code. And then on the way back out, it would go into that wrapper again, that decorator, and it might log like when this thing ended, for instance, right?
Sure.
Or if I
Okay.
were doing error handling in a common way, I could have an error handling decorator, and it would just wrap this in a try catch. Any exception that was thrown from here would get caught in that single decorator, and I could do a common whatever, log it, alert somebody, whatever I want to do from there. So that's, if you're using Mediator, that's typically what you would do for those types of cross-cutting concerns.
Awesome.
We're not showing that here, but that would be how you would level up this architecture a little bit more.
Cool.
Very cool. A question I had for you, Steve, when you were showing off the unit tests, question that immediately came to mind is what convention do you use for naming your unit test methods?
I have a blog article on this, but basically I like for them to read as sentences. So when you look at your test output here, so Test Explorer, and you see your unit tests, you could say, something like generate brands cache key should return a brands cache key, and return this, and these are boring. But there's the idea that you have a sentence that's made from this. Is helpful, so that when something fails, you know exactly what happened. So like this visit should set the path if the past expression was with a collection. I don't see anything that says it should not do anything. Like delete basket should do that. Set quantity should throw if it has these things. And so here you can see there's a little bit of inconsistency, and I've got two variations of my naming convention, and they're both here, and probably we should standardize to one or the other, but they both work. All right, so in the one case, let's look at this test. This one says should set the path if past expression with collection, and it's just a class visit on this query for including this visit thing. And so when you read that, it says, this class, this method should do whatever, right? Then the other one, I lost my Test Explorer. There we go. The other example doesn't need to have should, right? So here's a method basket service, set quantities, throws. So now instead of saying set quantities should throw given an invalid basket ID, we can get rid of some of that verbiage and just say set quantities throws given invalid basket ID. So now it's sort of an imperative requirement, right? And so you could actually write tests if you were doing BDD style. You could say here's all my tests that are not implemented yet that define what the requirements are for this application, and I could say this set quantities method throws if it's given this, throws if it's given that, returns true given this, returns false given that, and those are your tests. Those are your test cases, and then as you implement them, those tests start to pass.
That's awesome. I like that. I like how as a consumer of this, since it's open source, if I was to come in here and make some changes and have a pull request, I could run those tests. And if something starts breaking,
you'll be clear. It'll be obvious what it is. Yeah. What you don't want is something that just has like test 1, test 2, test 3, or you get customer service or order service, and you've got order service tests, right? And then each test is some generic name. Like that doesn't work very well from my perspective. Like when those tests fail, they don't really tell you just at a glance what the problem is, and so that's why I prefer this convention.
I agree. My next question, again, while we're on the topic of unit testing, is what sort of test coverage level do you aspire to when you're working on a project like this? There's the common debate that says, well, if you try and hit 100% test coverage, there's no real return on investment at that point. Is there some magical number that you strive for?
I don't really worry too much about test coverage as a particular number goal, because it's too easy to game that number, right? I could write some code. I could write one unit test that uses a reflection and hits every property on every DTO and every class in my system, and calls its getter and setter. And with that one unit test, I could have like 50% test coverage of the whole system, depending on how many properties there are in it. But that's not necessarily useful. But you end up with developers, if you put in a mandate that says you must do this, they'll end up doing things just to kind of check the block and follow the rule, instead of doing what the tests are intended for, which is to verify behavior from the customer's perspective or the client's perspective. um, and so what I'd like to see is that the test coverage is consistent and hopefully consistently increasing over time. And so some of the build tools that I use will give you a graph of test coverage over time. TeamCity is good for that, and I've been trying to find plugins for GitHub Actions and Azure DevOps that will show me that same data. But if I can see that it's going up over time and that new code is all being checked in with tests, which will tend to make it go up over time, that's more important to me than an arbitrary number. Most of my clients have legacy code bases that they're either trying to roll forward to .NET Core, or they're just trying to improve and reduce their technical debt and improve how quickly they're able to make updates and changes to that code. And so they don't necessarily have a ton of tests already, but if they're able to see over time that test coverage is increasing and other metrics that I will share with them are getting better and going in the right direction from a code quality perspective, that's what's important.
Awesome. That's good to hear. I guess the big takeaway here, folks, is don't test in production. Write unit tests. It does pay off in the long run, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing I'd point out is I've worked on enterprise teams where, you'll be handed a 50-page onboarding Word document, and you ask yourself at that point, why wasn't there a suite of unit tests that would help me, onboard myself and help me ramp up on this particular application that I'm expected to work on?
Yeah, it should take no time to get started on a project. You should be able to get pointed at the source control URL, and you should be able to do a clone, and you should be able to say .NET test, and everything should just work. Right? That should be the standard. And so if you are starting on a project and it takes you, a day to get up to speed because you have to read documentation and try and install tools and everything else, like that's just a whole waste of time. You should just be able to point yourself at the source control and go.
And is that the experience with this project? I mean, can I clone it in .NET Test and
Yeah, that's what this
magic
is.
happens?
This project right here that I'm showing you in Visual Studio, I literally just cloned here right before we started. And so it's, you can see at 11:53 a.m., 7 minutes before we were going to start the stream, I grabbed this and we fought with the fact that .NET Build couldn't find the solution file until we told it where it was. But once we did that, everything just built, right? So it should just build out of the box for you if you clone it down. And we strive to keep it that way as we make updates.
So I noticed you're using the JSON convert API there. Are you using Newtonsoft JSON here, or are you using the system text JSON API?
This is Newtonsoft. I think we haven't updated it yet to use the newer stuff, but this stuff's been around since years ago, so it's just been rolling forward with what worked. Nothing has forced us to move to something else, and this all works. So I think it's been in the not broke, don't fix category for now.
Cool.
But if that was something that we should change, or if that's something you'd like us to change, then it's open source, and you could add a pull request or file an issue.
You're creating all kinds of work for me, Steve.
So Scott, would the driving factor there be the performance benefit, or I'm just curious, why would they transition away from Newtonsoft?
And remember, this is just inside a test, right? This isn't even in the code for the website itself. But go ahead.
Right. So if you were to go out to our ASP.NET Core docs, we have a migration guide that shows how you would go from a 2.x app to a 3.x app. As I recall, one of the pieces of guidance we provide in that doc is for a large application, you might actually be better off just using Newtonsoft when migrating to 3.x. for compatibility reasons. If you were to migrate to 3.x and just rip out Newtonsoft and use system text JSON everywhere, you might have more issues than you really want to deal with. So in the doc that Steve has up on his screen here, you would see guidance on what I was talking about, how you would make that jump if you really wanted to. My experience has shown that it's really performance that you would migrate for, really no other reason.
Well, there's also, they added async APIs as well to it. So I don't know if that's ever important. Like if you have a bunch of things that need to be, deserialized over the wire and, huge amounts of data, you can do so asynchronously.
Yeah, that's a good point. I suppose there's also the argument that you want one less third-party dependency. You only want APIs that Microsoft has shipped in the box. That could be another reason. We also have another doc out there. I believe that one's in our .NET docs, and that is a full-on migration guide that would show you how to go from Newtonsoft to system.text.json. It would show you sort of, here's what the code would look like in Newtonsoft. Here's what that code would look like in system.text.json. Yep, this is the doc here.
I'm good at Googling.
My Google foo is weak today.
Well, you made it easy. I just typed what you said.
Verbatim.
Yeah, I didn't even know this document existed. I'm gonna have to go check this one out.
So I was going to say, one of our team members, Tom Dykstra, spent a lot of time writing this doc. Worked with our product team doing that.
All right, if I wanted to implement this right now, real quick, have you used this enough to know that it's going to be pretty easy? I mean, if literally all I want to do is do a JSON convert serialized object and replace that with var model2 equals system.text.json.deserialize object. See, that's not a thing. Like, what's the equivalent?
Yeah, I would have to
do that line.
I would have to reference that doc that you just pulled up. I don't know it well enough yet to be able to tell you just, here's what you need to do.
I think there's a JSON serializer that you have to walk up to. So.
All right, maybe we won't do that live on stream then.
No, let's try it. Go back.
Try it. All right. You tell me. JSON convert dot deserialize object using.
No, we don't need Google. Just go back. We're gonna start hacking away.
No.
We saw how well that worked out in the last episode.
Let me do one Google. Okay, so this JSON serializer is what you think we want.
That's what I said. Yeah.
It is what you said. That's exactly. But is it JSON serializer to deserialize too, or is there a JSON deserializer that I use? I guess it's a deserializer. So it looks like that's what I want.
Yeah.
All right.
JSON serializer dot.
But is it really well named that it's a serializer that's deserializing? Shouldn't it be a deserializer? Really?
I'm so confused right now.
Because why am I using a serializer to deserialize things? That just seems backwards.
String response.
I feel like using an encoder to decode things. All right, that should be all I need, right? If I can get rid of this junk now. That's right? Except it doesn't like this. Cannot convert from string to a JSON reader. That's a JSON string. There must be an extension method or something I need.
Yeah, there is.
Is that the right JSON serializer, though? Because it looked like it was coming from.
That's still from Newtonsoft. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right. System.text.json. Haha, there we go. Good call. Let's get rid of that. And I think that's all we need. So let's clean that up a little bit.
You got a red squiggly down on 38 too.
Well, that's because I get rid of the.
Because you got rid of the Newton using.
All right, that is all on one line. All right, I was trying to put it on one line, but it wouldn't let me. And control.
I appreciate what we're doing here because this is what a typical day looks like for most developers. The struggle is real,
All right, so that should be the same, and then I can just get rid of this and control dot that and tell it I want system text JSON there. And do the same here.
So the change would have been to change JSON converter to JSON serializer and change the using from Newtonsoft to system.text.json.
Right. The final change was pretty minor. So if we look at this in a diff, after all my typing, come on, bring it up.
Wait for it.
There we go. I had to save it first. Yeah, exactly. So we ripped out Newtonsoft JSON, replaced it with system text JSON, and we changed JSON convert to JSON serializer. So that's not bad at all.
But does it turn green in the test explorer?
Yeah.
Well, that is the question. So right click, run tests. Here's our little green check mark.
And if it doesn't, I'm just going to blame Scott for pushing so hard on changing this.
That's fair. I wouldn't,
boom,
I'm used to it.
All right, so now I can just go and I can say create a new branch. We'll call it Ardalis/system text JSONify, and we'll create that, and we'll go to my changes and say migrated some tests to use system.text.json because Scott said so. We want to sync that, and we want to push that. Boom. And then we go back out to the interwebs, and we go over here, and there should be a little thing telling me I can do a pull request. There it is. Let's make a pull request. And we did that, and we'll create this pull request, which I'll take a look at later and merge in. And maybe we'll go through and add some more things so we're consistent across the board. But that's how easy it is to make a change to this since it's open source. Anybody can do what I just did. You don't have to be a committer or a contributor on this project.
Well, and that was literally 5 minutes from the time we all said, yeah, let's do it, to the time you created that pull request right there was 5 minutes.
Oh, things are failing.
There is one problem with that pull request though. There's an argument null exception. Why?
Blame Scott.
Yep.
I don't know if that's related to what we just did though. I mean, we didn't change anything else, and it was green, and I did just literally run those tests. But that seems odd that would do it.
So for folks who are tuned in, just to recap what Steve's talking about right now, he's talking about the new system.text.json API that shipped with .NET Core 3.0. It's just a more performant solution to Newtonsoft JSON.
Yep.
It's more performant because it just returns null when you give it things.
Yeah.
That's the part I was hoping to leave out, but cat's out of the bag. On a more serious note, I believe it's based on the span of T API, so there are, as a result, fewer allocations being made under the hood, which is how performance is being improved.
Yeah, I think I remember actually seeing issues with this as well, Steve, because I converted some of my stuff to this. And what's going to happen is if you examine catalog items right now, it's going to be null. In fact, everything just looks null there. So I'm trying to remember why that is.
Does it need an encoding along with the string response? Because the string has all this JSON data. Maybe it needs.
I think so. I think there's a second parameter that we're missing. Just do comma after that and see what it.
JSON serial options.
I'm not gonna remember where the heck I did that.
Don't actually make everything null.
So I'm wondering, David, I'm wondering if you set that in your startup CS file, you can set the serialization options there.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Deserialize from UTF-8. Go up a little bit. Case sensitivity.
Up a little bit? Where do you see from UTF-8?
You shouldn't need a reader. No, I'm just, yeah, okay.
It seems like this is going to have what we need. Fields aren't supported. I'm not using fields. Let's look at my data that we're doing from. This go to definition. So this is just public properties, public class, getter setters on everything with IEnumerables.
IEnumerables should be supported. Maybe they're not. Maybe you need to have concrete types, which would change your API and be terrible, and that shouldn't be the thing. Does it say anything in here about IEnumerable? If you just
read-only properties are not supported. Let's see, Control F, IEnumerable. No, it doesn't say anything about that specifically. List works. Well, a quick way to check this is if I just make these lists and then rerun our tests. All right, which is right here. We can just say run these tests.
Assuming that compiles.
Assuming that compiles, which it didn't.
You might have things that are using it as an IEnumerable rather than just
The
like
list ought to work still though, because a list implements IEnumerable, so it shouldn't care.
Huh.
Oh, we're in the middle of doing this options thing.
yeah.
Let me get this breakpoint out of my way. And we'll run this one more time. From here this time. Can I implicitly convert? Okay, maybe you were right. List async. What is this? Read-only list. New catalog view model.
Yeah, because those assign it directly to. So after your select, do .toList.
Okay, right there.
And those two will have to be. You can wrap those in parens and do .toList.
Right. Because otherwise it's a task.
But that's not ideal either. We'll have to figure that out. I'm really curious now why.
We should follow up on that and see, maybe have a sample created for that scenario.
Yeah.
Because, our first instinct should always be that the framework is broken if our code has bugs. But in this case, that may be accurate. I don't like to assume that it's a problem with the framework, but we'll see if this fixes it. Nope. All right, still system argument null. So that did do it. So like we said, the model was not null, but catalog items was. So why is it not deserializing into catalog items? We thought there might be another parameter. I think that's still where we need to go with this. So.
Oh, actually, undo this real quick. Like if you were to have your breakpoint and you hover over the string response, I'm curious what that JSON actually looks like. Because I think it's pretty picky about double quotes and stuff like that. So JSON strings, property names, and string values. I remember seeing something like that where if it was like double quotes versus single quotes and stuff, like it could get really problematic. So that seems valid. Yeah, that should be perfect.
I know there are differences like that between the two. I think out of the box, Newtonsoft supports comments in JSON, which just, some would argue that's wrong because it's not part of the JSON spec.
There's no comments here, so that's not an issue. This is just standard JSON coming back from an ASP.NET Core API.
Yeah.
And it's double quoted and it looks all fine. So what else could it be? There must be some other option. There's deserialization behavior says property name matching is case sensitive. You can specify case insensitivity. I think I need that. So how do I do that? I need to actually do this. All right. There's got to be a quicker way to do that, I hope, but we'll say comma options. I'll bet that's the issue because they definitely don't match in case. So let's just run this.
Well, and the other thing is there's a setting for quoted numbers. It says that Newtonsoft could support quoted numbers, whereas the new one can't, which is weird.
All right, and if this does work, it did work. All right, so that's it. So it's this case insensitive thing. So I would have to add this every time, which would get old. So what I would do instead is I would create a helper method for this that would always do this because that's what I want, and then I'd use that in my test. So let's do that real quick.
I think the alternative to that is you can actually define it in your startup CS as a global setting if you want it to be applied globally.
But the difference.
How do I do that in a test though?
Right.
Good point.
Is there some global thing I can do on the behavior of it in the tests?
The problem is you're using static, right? The JSON converter static one.
Exactly. Now I
yeah.
can have it be an actual thing, but I guess I'll just create an options here. So let's say JSON serializer options, JSON options equals new, JSON serializer options. Can I just set it here? Property name case insensitive equals true, like that. So I can let me get away with that?
Yep.
Probably. Good. So then I can get rid of this and take this. It's not liking it. So we're gonna have to change it. I'll just do it in a constructor and do that. And
Why doesn't it like it? Oh, it doesn't need the semicolon. Get rid of that.
okay, that was bad. All right, now we can build. And let's run the test this time before we do our next commit.
I love live coding. It's so much fun. Especially when I'm not the one doing it. I just get to watch and like say, "Hey, do this, do that."
Well, now I feel bad. I'm responsible for this mess.
Oh, now we figured it out. Look, tests are passing. Everything's happy. This is good. This is progress. So changes here. Added case insensitive JSON options to fix broken tests. And we'll just commit all that and push it up.
I wonder if there's a way, since the JSON serializer exposes a static method. I wonder if there's a way to specify statically at some point in time, like on app startup, even for just unit tests, a way to
Change
set
that
those options.
default. Yeah.
That's kind of where I was headed with my startup CS idea. I was hoping there was an equivalent for that for the tests. I don't know.
Yeah, this is annoying because that's like every DTO that uses C# naming is going to be different from default JSON naming. Like that's just how
Right.
it is. Like this is what JSON is going to look like. It's going to be a lowercase first letter, and the C# equivalent is going to be a capital. So like, why is the default broken for every default?
Yeah, the default should be
sense.
switched.
So I think we just proved my point that if you're migrating a large app, and just
there could be some pain. Yeah.
Yeah, cold turkey cut over to the new serializer. You should be prepared for issues like what we've demonstrated here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I had done a long time ago is I'd written a bunch of extension methods that were published, and one of them was to take walk up to string and have an extension method for string and say, from JSON to the type parameter being the type that you want it to do. And under the covers, it was doing a JSON convert. It would be easy to change that there, and it still worked because we could specify statically in the context of our extension method the options that we would expect, right?
Right. Yeah, if you had that extension method, you would have a theme where you could change how the behavior was in one place, which is really a smart thing to do, especially if you're using static stuff. If you introduce your own static thing in between the static thing you're using, then later on when you have to change it, you've got one place to fix it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Cool. Well, we're at our time box. This has been awesome. I appreciate, Steve, you jumping on last minute, in fact, and coming so well prepared and going through all of this and sharing your experiences with the book and the success of the app and all the amazing innovations there. And thank you so much.
You're welcome. And one last thing before you go, there's actually a whole lot of cool stuff we didn't even get into in the application core, like the use of the specification pattern, which I'd love to talk about some other time, or for people to just go investigate on their own, because not enough people know about it, and they ought to check that out.
Awesome. We'll have to have you on a future show for sure.
So speaking of future shows, Dave, we've started booking our talent out like ahead of time. I mean, with the exception of Steve, who came last minute. So who do we have next week?
Next week we're gonna have Heather Downing, who's an advocate for Okta, a friend of mine, and she's an amazing individual. And we're gonna talk .NET, and then beyond that, we're gonna have Nick Craver from Stack Overflow. We're gonna have Corey Weathers from Twilio. We're gonna have Ed Charbonneau from Telerik. It just gets better and better. It's gonna be an amazing set of future shows. So we're super grateful to have such an awesome lineup.
Yeah, agreed. So with that, if there's nothing else that we have to add, thank you, Steve, for joining us this week on such late notice, and we hope to see our viewers again next week on the .NET Docs. Thanks.
Cool.
Thank you.
See you,
Thanks.
everybody.